A waitress humiliates an elderly veteran without noticing who is watching everything nearby. Subscribe and write where you are watching from. The morning sunlight seeped through the cracked blinds of a tiny apartment, casting long shadows over a modest space filled with remnants of a life once lived with pride. Dust particles floated lazily in the air as the muffled sounds of the city stirred awake outside. In the far corner of the room, an old wooden shelf bore the weight of a few faded photographs, several worn books, and a small box containing military medals. The medals gleamed faintly, a stark contrast to the peeling wallpaper and scuffed wooden floor. Jerome Harper, a former Marine, stirred on the sagging couch that served as both his bed and refuge. He ran a hand over his weathered face, feeling the rough texture of his skin, years of toil, sun, and hardship etched into every line. His salt and pepper beard, though neatly trimmed, could not disguise the deep exhaustion in his eyes. As he sat up, his joints protested with a stiffness that had become all too familiar. The apartment reflected Jerome's life, functional but stripped of any luxuries. A single hot plate served as his kitchen. A rickety chair and small table were his dining area, and the couch, threadbare and patched, was his haven. On a small stool next to the couch rested a carefully folded military uniform, its creases still sharp despite its age. It was a relic of his former life, a time when he had a purpose, a mission, and camaraderie. The day stretched ahead of him, vast and empty. Jerome had no work to report to, no family to visit, and no plans to make. His world had shrunk to a series of monotonous rituals, and yet he clung to them as though they were lifelines. This morning, as he prepared to face another day, he decided to break the pattern. He would visit a local cafe he had passed by several times. It wasn't much, a small, unassuming place on the corner of a busy street, but it was a change, a step outside the four walls that had become both his prison and his sanctuary. As Jerome splashed cold water on his face from the tiny bathroom sink, his gaze caught his reflection in the cracked mirror. The face staring back at him was that of a survivor, though one wearied by battles beyond the battlefield. His mind drifted to memories of the past, the camaraderie of his unit, the adrenaline of missions, and the crushing loss of friends who didn't make it back. The weight of those memories pressed down on him, but he pushed them aside. Today was about facing the present, no matter how daunting it felt. Jerome, dressed in his cleanest clothes, which still bore signs of wear, faded jeans, a plain button-up shirt, and an old jacket that had seen better days. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair and laced up his scuffed boots. As he stepped out into the world, the city greeted him with its usual indifference. Cars honked in the distance, pedestrians bustled past without a glance, and the faint aroma of fresh bread wafted from a nearby bakery. The walk to the cafe was unhurried, a deliberate pace that allowed Jerome to observe the world around him. He passed by storefronts with gleaming windows displaying goods he couldn't afford, families sharing laughter over breakfast, and young professionals rushing to catch buses. Each scene felt like a reminder of what he no longer had: a home filled with warmth, a career that gave him purpose, and connections that anchored him to something larger than himself. As Jerome neared the cafe, his steps faltered for a moment. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers made his chest tighten. He knew all too well how people looked at him, an old veteran with a worn appearance and little to his name. But he steadied himself, taking a deep breath before crossing the threshold. The cafe was modest, with a handful of tables and chairs scattered across a tiled floor. The walls were painted in warm hues, though the paint was chipped in places. A counter lined with pastries and a coffee machine stood at the back, where a young woman in a slightly crumpled uniform tended to the register. Her name tag read Lauren. She didn't look up as Jerome entered, her attention fixed on her phone. Jerome scanned the room, noting the mix of patrons. A group of college students occupied one table, their voices lively as they discussed something on a laptop. An elderly couple sat quietly in the corner, sipping coffee and sharing a newspaper. By the window, a man in a black baseball cap and sunglasses sat alone, a cup of tea in front of him and a notebook open on the table. He appeared absorbed in his writing, occasionally pausing to sip his drink. Jerome chose a table near the window, where he could watch the world pass by outside. He sat down slowly, the weight of his body settling into the chair as though it carried more than just his physical form. For a moment, he simply observed, his gaze drifting from one patron to another. He could feel the subtle glances directed his way, the faint whispers that accompanied them. He placed his hands on the table, fingers tracing the faint scratches on its surface. It felt strange to be in a space like this, a place where people gathered to connect, to unwind, to share moments. Jerome hadn't experienced such moments in years. His world had become one of solitude, punctuated only by fleeting interactions that rarely left an impression. Lauren eventually approached, her expression neutral, but her tone clipped as she asked for his order. Jerome hesitated, unsure of what to choose. He settled on a simple cup of coffee and a piece of toast, his voice steady but quiet. Lauren scribbled on her notepad without meeting his gaze, then walked away without a word. As Jerome waited, he noticed the man in the baseball cap glance his way briefly before returning to his notebook. There was something familiar about the man, though Jerome couldn't place it. He dismissed the thought, focusing instead on the task of simply existing in this unfamiliar setting. The coffee arrived, its warmth and aroma providing a small comfort. Jerome wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A moment of solace in a world that often felt cold and unyielding. Unbeknownst to Jerome, the events of this day would set into motion a chain of interactions that would challenge his perceptions, ignite dormant hopes, and remind him of the power of human connection. For now, though, he sat quietly, a lone figure amidst the hum of a cafe that seemed, at first glance, like any other. The air inside the cafe was tinged with the faint scent of brewed coffee, caramelized sugar, and something industrial. Perhaps the lingering essence of cleaning chemicals barely masking the wear of the establishment. It was a place caught in a strange limbo, neither pristine enough to exude charm, nor dilapidated enough to warrant complete avoidance. Instead, it existed in a state of resigned mediocrity, much like the lives of many who pass through its doors. Jerome's table was positioned by the window, offering a view of the street outside where people moved briskly in the chill of the early morning. Their hurried steps were accompanied by the occasional puff of visible breath, and the rhythm of the city outside contrasted sharply with the lethargic pace inside the cafe. The muffled clatter of cups and the low hum of conversation formed a background noise that was oddly soothing. The cafe itself was modest in size, with a layout that suggested practicality over comfort. The tables and chairs were mismatched, as if sourced from garage sales and thrift stores, their surfaces scarred by years of use. The floor was tiled in a checkerboard pattern, though the white tiles had long since dulled to gray, and the black ones bore scratches that revealed hints of the concrete beneath. The walls were painted in shades of cream and soft brown, but the paint was chipped in places exposing the original drywall. Above the counter, a menu board hung slightly askew, its handwritten chalk offerings listing everything from basic black coffee to more indulgent options like caramel lattes and hazelnut mochas. Beneath it, a glass display case housed pastries of varying freshness. Oversized muffins with slightly sticky tops, croissants whose golden crusts betrayed a lack of true flakiness, and cookies that looked just a little too uniform to be homemade. Behind the counter stood Lauren, a young woman whose disheveled appearance and lack of enthusiasm suggested she was counting down the minutes until her shift ended. Her hair, dyed a bright shade of auburn that clashed slightly with her pale complexion, was tied into a loose ponytail, and her uniform shirt bore the creases of having been pulled from the bottom of a laundry basket. A name tag pinned to her chest proclaimed her identity with a handwritten Lauren, scrawled in bold black marker. Lauren's attitude was as unpolished as her uniform. She moved with a lethargy that bordered on defiance, her gestures exaggerated in a way that made even the simplest tasks seem burdensome. Her interactions with the customers were clipped, her tone hovering somewhere between indifference and irritation. For her, this job was a temporary inconvenience, a stopgap measure on the way to something better. Or so she told herself. The patrons of the cafe were as varied as the pastries in the glass case. At one table sat a group of college students, their laughter spilling into the room as they passed around a laptop. Their backpacks were slung over the backs of their chairs, and their table was cluttered with empty coffee cups and crumpled napkins. They seemed oblivious to the world outside their conversation, their energy and optimism creating a stark contrast to the subdued atmosphere around them. In the corner, an elderly couple shared a quiet moment over 2 steaming mugs of tea. The man read aloud from a newspaper, his voice a soft murmur, while the woman nodded along, her hands cradling her cup. Their presence lent a certain warmth to the room, a reminder of a quieter, simpler time. By the window, a man in a black baseball cap and sunglasses sat alone, a cup of tea in front of him and a notebook open on the table. He appeared deeply engrossed in his writing, occasionally pausing to glance out the window or take a sip from his cup. There was an air of quiet confidence about him, an ease that suggested he was no stranger to solitude. Jerome took all of this in as he sipped his coffee. The warmth of the cup, a small but welcome comfort against the chill that seemed to have settled in his bones. He noticed the way Lauren avoided eye contact as she moved about the cafe, her demeanor bristling with a defensiveness that seemed misplaced. He noticed, too, the way the college students dominated the space with their energy, their laughter a sharp contrast to the subdued tones of the elderly couple in the corner. He also noticed the man in the baseball cap, whose presence felt somehow familiar, though Jerome couldn't quite place why. The man's movements were unhurried, his attention divided between his notebook and the street outside. Jerome found himself wondering what the man was writing, what thoughts filled the pages of his notebook. As Jerome sat quietly, the cafe began to reveal its rhythm. Orders were placed and fulfilled, conversations ebbed and flowed, and the sound of a spoon clinking against a ceramic mug punctuated the stillness. It was a place of small, ordinary moments, a microcosm of the city outside. Lauren eventually approached Jerome's table with his coffee and toast, setting them down with an air of detachment. She didn't ask if he needed anything else, didn't offer a smile or a word of welcome. Her movements were mechanical, as if she were fulfilling a duty rather than engaging with a human being. Jerome thanked her quietly, but she had already turned away, her attention back on the counter. Jerome's toast was slightly burnt at the edges, the butter unevenly spread, but he ate it without complaint. The coffee, though, was surprisingly good, strong and rich with a hint of bitterness that matched the mood of the day. He sipped it slowly, savoring the moment, the simple act of sitting in a warm space with a hot drink feeling almost luxurious. Unbeknownst to Jerome, his presence had not gone unnoticed. The man in the baseball cap had glanced his way several times, his expression unreadable behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses. Lauren, too, had noted his arrival, her gaze lingering on him briefly before she resumed her duties. Even the college students had paused their chatter momentarily when he walked in, though they quickly returned to their animated discussion. For Jerome, this was simply another moment in a life that often felt like a series of quiet, unremarkable days. But for those around him, his presence was a subtle disruption, a reminder of lives lived differently, of struggles they could only imagine. The cafe, with its mismatched furniture and unspoken rules, had become a stage where the small dramas of life played out, each character unaware of the role they would soon play in a story far larger than themselves. Jerome sat at his table, gazing absently out of the cafe window. The cup of coffee in his hands provided a small, steady warmth, but his thoughts drifted to less comforting places. It had been years since he had felt truly welcomed anywhere, and though the cafe's humdrum atmosphere seemed neutral enough, the weight of subtle stares and whispered comments pressed against him. From the counter, Lauren shot him a glance that lasted a beat too long, her lips curling into a faint smirk. She nudged her co-worker, a wiry young man who was sweeping near the back, and muttered something that made him chuckle. Jerome pretended not to notice, taking a slow sip of his coffee and lowering his eyes to the table. He didn't need to hear the words to know their meaning. He had lived through enough encounters like this to recognize the signs. At the far end of the cafe, the group of college students erupted into laughter, their energy filling the room. One of them, a young man in a hoodie emblazoned with the logo of a local university, tilted his head toward Jerome and whispered something to his companions. They all turned their heads, their gazes lingering just long enough to make Jerome shift uncomfortably in his chair. The ripple of amusement that followed was quiet but unmistakable. Jerome clenched his hand around the coffee cup, his knuckles whitening. He reminded himself to stay calm, to let it pass. It wasn't worth responding. It never was. He focused on the simple ritual of eating his toast, even though the edges were burnt and the butter unevenly spread. He didn't mind. It was food, and it was warm. But as he bit into it, a piece of crust crumbled onto the table, drawing another round of stifled giggles from the students. The cafe, which had felt like a sanctuary only moments ago, was beginning to close in around him. The voices seemed louder, the glances sharper, and the air heavier. Jerome shifted in his seat, adjusting his jacket as if the gesture might shield him from their scrutiny. At that moment, Lauren approached his table, a tray balanced casually on one hand. Her movements were deliberate, her expression a mask of poorly concealed disdain. She stopped in front of him and looked down, her gaze flicking over his worn clothes and weathered hands. "Everything okay over here?" she asked, her tone saccharine but laced with mockery. Jerome nodded, his voice steady but quiet. "Yes, thank you." Lauren didn't move. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her lips twisting into a smirk. "You sure? Don't want to overstay your welcome or anything." The words hung in the air like a slap, sharp and unexpected. Jerome froze, unsure of how to respond. He felt the weight of the room's attention shift toward their interaction. The students stopped whispering, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Even the elderly couple in the corner glanced up from their tea, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Jerome forced a small smile, hoping to diffuse the moment. "I'm fine, thank you." Lauren raised an eyebrow, clearly unsatisfied with his lack of reaction. "Good," she said, straightening up, "because we don't usually get, customers like you in here." Her voice carried just enough venom to make her meaning clear, and a few patrons exchanged awkward glances. The students, however, seemed to find her comment hilarious, their laughter spilling over like a wave. One of them even raised his phone, angling it toward Jerome as if capturing the scene for posterity. Jerome's chest tightened, but he kept his composure. He had faced far worse in his life, on the battlefield, in the aftermath of returning home to a society that seemed to have forgotten him. This was nothing compared to that. Still, the sting of her words lingered, a reminder of the invisible barriers he faced every day. Lauren, apparently satisfied with her performance, turned and sauntered back to the counter, her tray swinging at her side. Jerome exhaled slowly, his grip on the coffee cup loosening. He reminded himself that this was just another moment to endure, another challenge to overcome. But as he looked around the cafe, he realized that the laughter and whispers hadn't stopped. The group of students seemed emboldened by Lauren's behavior. One of them, a young woman with brightly dyed hair, leaned over to her friend and whispered something that made him laugh loudly. Another student, a tall, lanky man with a camera slung around his neck, muttered, "Bet he's not even gonna tip." The comment drew a few chuckles, and Jerome felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and shame. He had intended to leave a tip, small though it might have been, but now even that gesture felt tainted, as if it would only reinforce their mockery. As the minutes dragged on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Lauren returned to the table once more, this time with a glass of water. She set it down with a clink that seemed louder than necessary, then stood there for a moment, her hand on her hip. "Here," she said, her tone dripping with insincerity. "On the house. Thought you might need it." Jerome looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He wanted to say something, to call her out for her cruelty, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded politely and murmured, "Thank you." Lauren rolled her eyes and walked away, muttering under her breath. The students erupted into laughter again, their voices echoing through the cafe. Jerome stared at the glass of water, his reflection distorted by the ripples. He didn't touch it. At the far end of the room, the man in the baseball cap shifted in his seat. He had been watching the interaction intently, his gaze following Lauren as she moved back to the counter. His hands rested on the notebook in front of him, but he didn't write anything. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Jerome, unaware of the man's attention, turned his gaze back to the window. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened. People walked by, cars sped down the street, and life moved forward in its relentless march. But inside the cafe, time seemed to stand still, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Unwilling to meet anyone's gaze, Jerome finished his toast in silence. He told himself it didn't matter, that he would leave soon and forget about this place, but deep down he knew the sting of humiliation would linger long after he stepped outside. The cafe, once a place of small comforts, had become a battlefield of its own, a place where dignity was challenged and kindness seemed in short supply. For now, Jerome remained seated, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet man in the baseball cap was about to change everything. Jerome's hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, his fingers tracing the grooves in the worn surface as if searching for something tangible to anchor him. The laughter and whispers from the college students continued to ripple through the cafe, each wave breaking against his resolve to stay calm. The glass of water sat untouched, its surface shimmering faintly in the morning light. Across the room, the man in the black baseball cap observed the unfolding scene with quiet intensity. He was a study in contrasts, calm yet alert, his every movement deliberate. The sunglasses he wore obscured his expression, but there was no mistaking the sharpness of his gaze. He took in the subtle dynamics of the room, Lauren's smug smirk as she leaned against the counter, the students' unabashed amusement, and the quiet dignity with which Jerome endured their scrutiny. The man's posture was relaxed, but his presence was anything but passive. He tapped a pen against the edge of his notebook, a rhythmic motion that seemed to mirror the growing tension in the room. Occasionally, he glanced down at the pages in front of him, where lines of neat handwriting spilled across the paper. It was unclear whether he was writing observations, thoughts, or something entirely unrelated, but the act itself seemed purposeful. Jerome remained unaware of the man's attention. His focus was on the window, where the outside world offered a momentary reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere of the cafe. He watched as a young woman hurried past with a bouquet of flowers, her scarf trailing in the breeze. For a brief moment, he imagined what it would be like to give someone flowers again, and to have someone in his life who might smile at such a gesture. The thought was fleeting, chased away by the sound of Lauren's voice. "Hey, you gonna drink that water or just stare at it all day?" she called out from the counter, her tone laced with mockery. Jerome didn't respond. He simply reached for the glass, his movements slow and deliberate, and took a sip. The action was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to quiet the room for a moment. The college students exchanged glances, their amusement dimmed but not extinguished. The man in the cap set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His lips pressed into a thin line, and, for the first time, his gaze lingered on Lauren. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet, steady intensity that seemed to carry more weight than any words could. Lauren, oblivious to the scrutiny, returned to her phone, scrolling through messages with a bored expression. The students resumed their chatter, their voices rising and falling in waves that filled the silence left by Jerome's quiet defiance. The man in the cap took a sip of his tea, his movements unhurried. He glanced towards the elderly couple in the corner who had returned to their newspaper and tea. Their presence, though subdued, lent a certain balance to the room, a reminder that kindness and dignity still existed, even in small, quiet ways. Jerome, meanwhile, had finished his coffee and was now staring at the empty cup. He debated whether to order another or simply leave, but something kept him rooted to his seat. Perhaps it was the stubbornness that had carried him through countless hardships, or perhaps it was the faint, unspoken hope that the day might yet turn around. The man in the cap seemed to sense this internal struggle. He straightened in his chair, his sunglasses catching the light as he turned his attention fully to Jerome. There was a brief moment of hesitation, as though he were weighing his next move, before he stood and began walking toward the counter. The cafe grew noticeably quieter as he moved. His presence commanded attention, not because he demanded it, but because there was something inherently magnetic about him. Even Lauren looked up from her phone, her expression flickering with a hint of curiosity. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Could I get a refill on my tea?" Lauren blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She nodded quickly, reaching for the teapot. Sure. 1 second. As she poured, the man glanced over his shoulder, his gaze landing briefly on Jerome. It was a subtle gesture, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that seemed to shift the energy in the room. Thanks, he said, taking the cup from Lauren. And, while you're at it, I'd like to cover that gentleman's next order, whatever he wants. Lauren frowned, clearly unprepared for the request. Him? She asked, jerking her thumb in Jerome's direction. The man nodded. Yes. Him. The room fell silent. Even the students, who had been mid-laugh, paused to watch the exchange. Lauren hesitated, glancing between the man and Jerome as if trying to gauge the seriousness of the request. I mean, sure, she said finally, setting down the teapot. If that's what you want. It is, the man replied. His tone was firm but not unkind, leaving no room for argument. He turned and walked toward Jerome's table, his movements unhurried. As he approached, Jerome looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and caution. The man stopped a few feet away, his cup of tea in one hand and his notebook tucked under his arm. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice warm but steady. Jerome hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Sure, he said after a moment, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. The man sat down, setting his tea and notebook on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the interaction pressing down on everyone present. I couldn't help but notice what was going on, the man said finally, his tone gentle. Seemed like you could use a little backup. Jerome studied him, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was something familiar about the man, something he couldn't quite place, but there was also a sincerity in his words that was hard to ignore. Thanks, Jerome said quietly, but I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be, the man replied, his voice firm but not confrontational. Nobody should. The words hung in the air, resonating in a way that seemed to transcend the moment. For the first time in what felt like hours, Jerome felt a small flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Unbeknownst to the rest of the cafe, the man sitting across from Jerome was no ordinary patron. He was Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood actor known for his humility and quiet acts of kindness. And though his fame was not immediately apparent, his actions spoke volumes, setting the stage for a chain of events that would soon change everything. Jerome sat across from the man who had introduced himself simply as Kay. The conversation had been sparse but steady, a calm exchange that served as a balm to the sting of earlier humiliations. Kay's presence was unassuming, yet it carried a quiet strength that seemed to envelop the space around him. Jerome couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd seen this man before, but he dismissed it as wishful thinking. Celebrities didn't frequent places like this, and even if they did, why would they sit with him? The students, who had quieted momentarily after Kay joined Jerome, resumed their chatter, albeit at a lower volume. Their laughter occasionally pierced the air, a reminder that not everyone in the room shared the same sense of gravity. Lauren, meanwhile, hovered near the counter, her phone forgotten for the moment. Her eyes darted between Jerome and Kay, her expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. She didn't like the way Kay had intervened. It felt like a personal challenge, a disruption of her authority in this small world where she was used to being in control. She wiped her hands on a towel and moved toward the table, her steps deliberate. "Everything okay here?" Lauren asked, her tone tinged with false cheer as she approached the two men. Her gaze flicked to Kay, lingering for a moment before settling on Jerome. "Enjoying your little coffee date?" Jerome tensed, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. He opened his mouth to respond, but Kay spoke first. "We're fine," Kay said evenly, his calm tone carrying a subtle edge. He met Lauren's gaze directly, his expression unreadable behind the sunglasses. "Thank you." Lauren's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. She crossed her arms over her chest, the towel dangling from her fingers. "You know," she said, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of the students, "some people come in here and think they can just take up space without contributing. Kind of unfair to the rest of us, don't you think?" The room grew noticeably quieter. The students exchanged glances, their laughter fading into uneasy murmurs. Even the elderly couple in the corner paused, their newspaper lowered just enough to reveal their concerned faces. Kay leaned back in his chair, his movements deliberate. He placed his sunglasses on the table, revealing eyes that were sharp and unwavering. "I think everyone here has the right to enjoy their coffee in peace," he said calmly. "Don't you?" Lauren bristled, her cheeks flushing. "Sure," she said with a tight smile, "as long as they pay for it." Kay didn't flinch. "That won't be a problem," he said. "In fact, I've already covered his next order." Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, one of the students at the far table decided to chime in. "Hey, man," the young man in the hoodie called out, his tone half joking, half provocative. "You, like his bodyguard or something, 'cause you're really working overtime for him." Laughter rippled through the group, but it was uneasy, lacking the confidence it had carried earlier. Kay turned his head slowly toward the students, his expression unchanged. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his gaze seemed to silence them more effectively than any reprimand could. Jerome, for his part, wanted to disappear. He hated being the center of attention, especially in moments like this. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the sting of humiliation creeping back in. "It's fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I can handle it." Kay turned back to him, his expression softening. "You shouldn't have to," he said quietly. Lauren, sensing that the momentum of the moment was slipping away from her, decided to escalate further. She picked up the glass of water she had brought to Jerome earlier and held it up, the light catching the ripples on its surface. "Maybe this will help," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. Without warning, she tipped the glass forward, letting the water cascade over the table and onto Jerome's lap. The room froze. The students gasped, their amusement giving way to shock. The elderly couple exchanged horrified glances, their hands clasping tightly together. Even Lauren seemed momentarily startled by the weight of her own actions, though she quickly masked it with a smirk. Jerome sat perfectly still, the water soaking into his jeans and pooling on the floor beneath his chair. He felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation of being simultaneously exposed and invisible. His hands trembled as he reached for a napkin, his movements slow and deliberate. Kay, however, was not still. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and turned to face Lauren. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. "That," he said, his voice low and steady, "was completely unnecessary." Lauren shrugged, her smirk faltering. "It's just water," she said defensively. "What's the big deal?" "The big deal," Kay replied, his tone sharpening, "is that you just humiliated a man who did nothing to deserve it." Lauren opened her mouth to respond, but Kay didn't give her the chance. He turned to the rest of the cafe, his voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "Is this what we've come to?" he asked, addressing the room. "Sitting by and watching while someone is treated like they're less than human, laughing at someone else's expense because it's easier than standing up for what's right." The room was silent. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier bravado completely gone. The elderly couple exchanged guilty looks, their eyes lowering to the table. Even Lauren seemed taken aback, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Kay turned back to Lauren, his gaze steady. "You have a choice," he said. "You can apologize and try to make this right, or you can keep digging yourself into a hole that no one is going to help you out of." Lauren's face reddened, her hands clenching the towel in her grip. She looked around the room, searching for support, but found none. The students avoided her gaze, their expressions a mix of guilt and embarrassment. The elderly couple remained silent, their eyes fixed on their untouched cups of tea. Finally, Lauren muttered, "Fine, I'm sorry." The words were clipped, barely audible, but they were enough to break the tension in the room. Kay nodded, his expression softening. "Good," he said. "Now, let's move on." He turned back to Jerome, who was still dabbing at his soaked jeans with a napkin. Kay placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet reassurance. "You okay?" he asked. Jerome nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, thanks." As the room slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, Kay sat back down, his presence a steadying force in the aftermath of the conflict. For Jerome, the humiliation of the moment still lingered, but so did something else, a sense of gratitude, of having been seen and defended in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The cafe, once a place of indifference and quiet cruelty, had become a battleground for dignity and kindness. And though the scars of the morning's events would take time to heal, they had sparked a change that could not be ignored. The air in the cafe was thick with tension, as though the room itself had absorbed the weight of the confrontation. Conversations that had once been light and carefree were now subdued, and the faint hum of the coffee machine seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Even the clink of a spoon against a mug felt sharp, slicing through the fragile calm that had settled over the space. Jerome sat still in his chair, his soaked jeans clinging uncomfortably to his skin. He dabbed at them with the handful of napkins he had managed to gather, but the effort felt futile. The water was more than a physical discomfort. It was a reminder of the humiliation he had just endured. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, some filled with pity, others with guilt. None of them, however, had stepped in to stop what had happened. Across the table, Kay remained composed. His hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, and his gaze remained steady, surveying the room with quiet authority. There was no trace of anger in his expression, only a calm resolve that seemed to challenge anyone who might consider reigniting the conflict. Lauren had retreated to the counter, her face flushed with embarrassment. She busied herself with cleaning, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a visible unease. The students, too, had fallen silent, their laughter replaced by awkward glances and fidgeting hands. One of them, the young woman with the brightly dyed hair, leaned toward her friends and whispered something, but the others only shook their heads, unwilling to engage. For a moment, it seemed as though the cafe might settle back into its usual rhythm. The tension would dissipate, and the events of the morning would become just another unpleasant memory. But Kay wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm as he addressed Jerome. "You don't have to sit through this," he said. "No one deserves to be treated that way." Jerome looked up, his eyes meeting Kay's for the first time. There was a steadiness in Kay's gaze, a sincerity that was both comforting and disarming. Jerome hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He was used to enduring, to letting moments like these pass without confrontation. But Kay's words stirred something in him, a faint, flickering hope that perhaps things could be different. "I appreciate what you did," Jerome said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "But I'm used to this. It's just how things are." Kay shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "It doesn't have to be," he said, "not if we don't let it." The words hung in the air, resonating in a way that felt almost tangible. Jerome glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the other patrons. Some looked away when he met their gaze, but others held his eyes, their expressions filled with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. For the first time, Jerome saw not just indifference, but the potential for something more, an unspoken acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong. One of the students, the young woman with the brightly dyed hair, stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor. All eyes turned to her as she approached Jerome's table, her steps hesitant but purposeful. "Hey," she said, her voice faltering slightly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for laughing earlier. It wasn't right." Jerome blinked, surprised by the unexpected apology. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, his expression softening. The young woman offered a small, apologetic smile before turning to Kay. "And thanks," she said, "for calling it out." Kay nodded, his expression warm but measured. "It's never too late to do the right thing." The woman returned to her table, and for a moment, the room seemed to shift. The students, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and unease, began to murmur among themselves. One of them, a tall, lanky man with glasses, stood up next, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Yeah, I'm sorry too," he said, addressing Jerome. "We shouldn't have been laughing. It wasn't cool." Jerome looked at the young man, his surprise giving way to a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply. As the apologies began to ripple through the room, the atmosphere grew lighter. The tension that had weighed so heavily on the cafe started to lift, replaced by a sense of collective accountability. Even the elderly couple in the corner, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, offered Jerome a kind smile and a nod of support. Lauren, however, remained at the counter, her back turned to the room. She busied herself with rearranging cups and wiping down surfaces, avoiding the growing chorus of apologies. It was clear that she was struggling to reconcile her actions with the consequences they had brought. Kay watched her for a moment before standing up and approaching the counter. The room fell silent again as he leaned against the edge, his posture relaxed but his gaze intent. "You still have a chance to make this right," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Lauren stiffened, her hands stilling on the counter. For a moment, she didn't respond, her shoulders tense with resistance. But then she exhaled slowly, setting down the towel she had been holding. She turned to face him, her expression guarded but no longer defiant. I don't know what you want me to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Kay tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. "An apology would be a good start," he said. "Not just for him, but for yourself. Carrying that kind of bitterness doesn't help anyone." Lauren hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Jerome, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of caution and hope. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have done that. It was wrong." Jerome nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "That means something." The room remained quiet as Lauren returned to her work, her movements more subdued. The patrons began to resume their conversations, though the energy in the cafe was noticeably different. The students were quieter, their laughter replaced by thoughtful murmurs. The elderly couple resumed their tea, their expressions softer. Jerome glanced at Kay, his gratitude unspoken but clear. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a burden or an object of pity, but as a person deserving of dignity and respect. It was a small victory, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Kay returned to his seat, his presence a steadying force in the room. He picked up his notebook and began to write, his pen moving steadily across the page. Whatever he was recording, it seemed to flow with an ease that matched the quiet transformation unfolding around him. The cafe, once a place of indifference and quiet cruelty, had become something different. A space where change felt possible, and where the small courageous acts of individuals could ripple outward in ways that mattered. For Jerome, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always the potential for light. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted noticeably since the confrontation. Where there had once been tension, there was now a sense of tentative harmony, as though the room itself had taken a collective deep breath. The hum of quiet conversations returned, accompanied by the soft clinking of cups and the faint hiss of the espresso machine. Yet, beneath the surface, the echoes of what had transpired lingered, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. Jerome sat in his seat, his body finally beginning to relax after the intense moments of conflict. The dampness in his jeans was still uncomfortable, but no longer felt like the overwhelming burden it had been. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the strange, unexpected turn his morning had taken. He had walked into the cafe expecting little more than a cup of coffee and a chance to sit in a warm space, yet here he was, the center of an unfolding narrative that felt almost surreal. Across the table, Kay remained calm and composed, his attention split between his notebook and the room around him. He seemed to have a natural ability to read the energy of a space, his movements and expressions calibrated to match the shifting dynamics. He glanced up occasionally, meeting Jerome's gaze with a small, reassuring nod, as if to say, "I'm still here." Lauren, who had been the instigator of much of the morning's drama, kept her head down as she worked behind the counter. Her earlier bravado had melted away, replaced by a quiet diligence that spoke of someone grappling with their own discomfort. She avoided eye contact with the patrons and spoke only when necessary, her voice subdued and lacking its previous edge. The students, who had been the loudest voices in the room earlier, were now subdued as well. Their laughter had ceased entirely, replaced by quiet murmurs as they exchanged thoughtful glances. It was clear that Kay's words had resonated with them, sparking a level of introspection that was both unexpected and uncomfortable. As Jerome sipped the last of his coffee, he noticed one of the students, the young man with the camera, rise from his seat and approach the counter. The man hesitated for a moment, glancing back at his friends as though seeking their approval before turning to Lauren. "Hey," he said awkwardly, his voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Can I get a cup of coffee for that guy over there, and, put it on my tab?" Lauren blinked, clearly surprised by the request. She hesitated for a moment before nodding, quickly preparing the order. When the coffee was ready, the young man carried it over to Jerome's table, setting it down with a sheepish smile. "Here," he said. "I figured you could use another one." Jerome looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but warm. The young man shrugged, his cheeks reddening slightly. "No problem," he said before hurrying back to his table. The small gesture seemed to break the lingering tension in the room, as though it had opened the door for others to step forward. One by one, other patrons began to approach Jerome's table, offering small words of kindness or apologies for their earlier silence. The elderly couple, who had been watching quietly from their corner, came over next. "We just wanted to say how sorry we are," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "We should have spoken up sooner." Jerome shook his head, offering a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," he said. "Really. Thank you for saying that." Her husband nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're a good man," he said. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." As the couple returned to their seats, Jerome felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just the kindness of their words. It was the simple fact that people were beginning to see him, truly see him, as more than just a shadow in the corner of the room. Kay watched the interactions with quiet satisfaction, his presence a steadying force in the midst of the unfolding change. He didn't insert himself into the conversations, choosing instead to let the room find its own rhythm. Occasionally, he jotted something down in his notebook, his pen moving swiftly across the page. Meanwhile, Lauren remained at the counter, her hands busy but her mind clearly elsewhere. She stole occasional glances at Jerome, her expression a mixture of regret and uncertainty. It was clear that she was wrestling with her own guilt, trying to reconcile her actions with the person she wanted to be. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached Jerome's table. Her movements were hesitant, and her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. When she reached the table, she took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Look," she began, her voice shaky. I'm sorry. For everything. I shouldn't have treated you that way." Jerome looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. He studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "Thank you," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." Lauren nodded, her cheeks flushing. I hope you'll come back," she said. "I'll make sure it's better next time." Jerome didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in the faces of the other patrons who had begun to offer him their support. He thought about how far the morning had come, from a place of humiliation to one of connection and possibility. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his tone light but sincere. Lauren nodded again, offering a small tentative smile before returning to the counter. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as though a long-held tension had finally been released. As the morning wore on, the cafe continued to buzz with quiet activity. Jerome remained at his table, sipping his second cup of coffee and reflecting on the events of the day. For the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps things could change, not just for him, but for others like him who had been pushed to the margins of society. Kay eventually rose from his seat, slipping his notebook into his bag and picking up his empty cup. He approached Jerome one last time, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've got more strength than most people I know," Kay said. "Don't forget that." Jerome looked up, his eyes meeting Kay's. "Thanks," he said simply, "for everything." Kay nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Without another word, he turned and left the cafe, his presence lingering like the faint aroma of coffee that filled the air. As the door closed behind him, Jerome felt a quiet resolve settle in his chest. The day had not been easy, but it had been transformative. For the first time in years, he felt not just seen, but valued, a reminder that even in the smallest moments, dignity could be reclaimed. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, but the air felt lighter, as if the weight of the morning's tension had finally lifted. Conversations flowed more freely, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. The hum of the espresso machine and the clink of dishes being cleared created a soothing background melody that carried an unspoken sense of closure. Jerome remained at his table, his second cup of coffee nearly empty. The warmth of the cup had long since faded, but he held it anyway, his fingers wrapped around the ceramic as though it were an anchor. The events of the day replayed in his mind, each moment unfolding with a clarity that felt almost surreal. The humiliation, the unexpected intervention, the apologies, they were all pieces of a story he hadn't expected to live through. For years, Jerome had felt invisible, his existence reduced to the margins of a world that moved on without him. But today, something had shifted. He had been seen, defended, and, in a way, celebrated. It was a small but profound reminder that even in the darkest corners, there were still glimmers of light. Lauren had kept her promise to leave him in peace, avoiding his table as she moved about the cafe. Her earlier apology had felt genuine, if not a little awkward, and Jerome found himself wanting to believe that it was the beginning of a change, not just for her, but for others who might cross his path. The students, too, seemed to have taken the events of the morning to heart. Their conversation was quieter now, marked by thoughtful pauses and occasional glances in Jerome's direction. The young man who had bought him a second coffee offered a small wave before leaving, his fellow friends trailing behind him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to leave an impression. As Jerome prepared to leave, the elderly couple approached his table once more. The woman offered him a kind smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We just wanted to say goodbye," she said softly, "and to thank you for your patience and for reminding us of what really matters." Her husband nodded in agreement. "Take care of yourself, son," he said, his voice warm and steady. "You're stronger than you think." Jerome nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." The couple departed, their presence leaving a lingering warmth in their wake. Jerome watched them go, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, but not an unwelcome one. The door to the cafe opened, letting in a brief gust of cool air as Kay stepped inside. Jerome hadn't expected to see him again, and his surprise must have shown, because Kay offered a small, knowing smile as he approached the table. "Thought I'd check in before heading out," Kay said, slipping into the seat across from Jerome. "How are you holding up?" Jerome hesitated, considering the question. "Better," he said finally. "A lot better than I was." Kay nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. You deserve that." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence. Kay's presence was steady and grounding, a quiet reminder that sometimes all it took to change a situation was one person willing to step forward. Jerome found himself wanting to say more, to express the depth of his gratitude, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he settled for something simple. "Thank you," he said, "for everything you did." Kay shrugged lightly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It wasn't much," he said, "just what needed to be done." "It was more than that," Jerome insisted. "You didn't have to get involved. Most people wouldn't have." Kay's smile softened, and for the first time, Jerome thought he saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his expression. I've been in your shoes before, Kay said quietly. Maybe not exactly, but close enough. Sometimes it just takes one person to remind you that you're not alone. The words hit Jerome with a force he hadn't expected. He nodded slowly, letting them sink in. Well, he said after a moment, you did that for me today. They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the conversation settling comfortably between them. Finally, Kay glanced at his watch and stood, tucking his notebook into his bag. I've got to head out, he said, but you'll be all right. I can see it. Jerome rose as well, extending a hand. Kay took it without hesitation, his grip firm and steady. Take care of yourself, Jerome, he said, and don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. Jerome nodded, his throat tightening. You too, he said, and thank you again. With that, Kay turned and walked toward the door, his steps unhurried. As he exited, he paused for a moment, glancing back with a small wave before disappearing into the bustling street outside. Jerome stood for a moment, watching the door swing shut behind him. The cafe felt different now, almost unrecognizable from the place it had been that morning. It was brighter, warmer, filled with the unspoken promise of change. As Jerome left the cafe, the cool air greeted him like an old friend. The street was alive with movement, people rushing past with their own stories and struggles. For the first time in a long time, Jerome felt like he was part of that world, not just an observer, but a participant. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. The weight he had carried for so long felt just a little lighter, and the road ahead seemed just a little brighter. And in his heart, he carried the memory of a stranger who had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten, that even in the smallest acts there was power. Power to change a moment, a day, a life. It was enough. Thank you for watching the rest of the video. Subscribe to not miss new stories and share this video with your friends. Leave comments. Your opinion is important. Watch other videos on the channel. There are many more interesting things to come.